Hello, YouTubers, French compatriots, Bluegrass shows, Dutch Search, Peasants, Vassals, Minions, Meat Sacks. I'm usefully welcome. So there was an announcement made at this year's CPAC. Trump's envoy, Richard Grinnell, came out and said that the U.S. would no longer be involved in regime changes. And recently also, the funds were frozen, not only for U.S. aid, which has been a front for CIA involvement in other countries, notably Ukraine, but also funds were cut off from the National Endowment for Democracy, so-called, that's been a front group for regime change around the globe for decades. And so I take this with a grain of salt, but it's great to hear that. It seems to be in line with Trump's ideas about non-intervention and certainly the whole idea of nation building. And I find that to be an immensely welcome change to U.S. policy if it's true. I hope to hear more announcements that are more official and more definite and with bigger headlines, because if the United States is not going to be involved in regime change anymore, that's going to be the turnaround of a policy the United States has had for the last century. And in fact, there's numbers out there that say that since the inception of this country, because we are involved in regime change operations since the inception of this country, in some respects, for example, Mexico and Canada, and that there's been 400 regime change operations by the United States since the inception of this country. And there's a couple of great lists. I don't usually put links, but I'll put links this time because Wikipedia has a great detailed listing of a lot of the regime change operations done by the United States in the last century. And then there's also a handy checklist of all the countries that it's fully documented that the CIA and the United States were involved in regime change. And one thing that strikes you is there's some that, of course, we know all too well. We've been trying to have regime change in Cuba since Castro was put into power, and those efforts continue. And there's countries like Venezuela where it's very obvious. But then you see this list, for example, and the United States was involved with regime change efforts in Australia in 1973. And we're also involved in regime change efforts in Portugal in 1974. And so there really are no limits to America wanting to reshape the world in various countries to fit the U.S. agenda and the U.S. empire. And a lot of this involves putting puppets in power, of course, like we did in Ukraine and other countries. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about U.S. regime change is we constantly use the mantra about spreading democracy around the world, but we only like democracy when the outcome favors the United States. And the fact that a lot of elections, particularly in South America, happen, and we don't like the results, and we immediately try to topple that government, or we're already in there already trying to manufacture the outcome we want in the election, and then it doesn't happen the way we want it to, and then we're back in there. And that's one of the other things about the list too. It shows that the United States will do regime change in a country. They'll make a 10-year effort, and they may or may not get the results they want, and they'll go back to that same country 10 or 20 years later. So these countries never really get off the list as long as we have a government in these countries that favors the United States and the United States agenda, then they're pretty much okay. But I won't go into the years of all these regime change efforts, but most of these are from the 20th century. A lot of them are in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when CIA and the United States were active around the globe for regime change. So let's go through this list: Afghanistan, Venezuela, Iraq, Haiti, Somalia, Honduras, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, China, Albania, East Germany, Iran, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Syria, Egypt, Indonesia, British Guiana, North Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Ecuador, Congo, France in 1965, Brazil, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Bolivia, Indonesia, Ghana, Chile, Greece, Costa Rica, Bolivia, Australia, Angola, Zaire, Portugal, Jamaica, Chad, Grenada, Yemen, Libya, Nicaragua, Panama, Bulgaria, Albania, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yugoslavia, and Ecuador. And as I pointed out, a lot of these countries show up repeatedly because we monitor whether we like the outcome of their elections and whether we approve of their leader and whether their leader plays ball. A good example, of course, is Ecuador. We did regime change in Ecuador in 1960 to 1963, and then we were back there in 2001. So a lot of times these regime changes can span decades. And one of the things I find interesting about U.S. regime change, of course, one is the fact that we talk about spreading democracy around the world, but we only want democracy if the outcome is what we want it to be. And then the other thing is the hypocrisy about talking about China or Iran or Russia and their minute efforts in a few countries to influence their elections or to interject. So, of course, we object to China backing North Vietnam and North Korea. We have a problem with Russia, and we have problems with Iran and their proxy forces in the Middle East. And yet the United States has been involved in regime change around the globe for 100 years. But my bottom line, once again, is this is a great announcement. It sounds like it's in line with Trump's foreign policy ideas and non-interventionism. And the fact that somebody actually came out and said that we're no longer in regime change business is definitely a breath of fresh air. And I hope it comes to be. It would be a radical change, and an incredibly radical change for U.S. policy going forward. And I completely welcome it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too?